This is the Skeptical Student Show, created as a part of Podcast Lab by India Film Project in association with Anchor by Spotify.
You can always listen to the episode on Fast Forward and follow the podcast to never miss new episodes. And while you're at it, don't forget to rate the podcast a 5-star.
Hello everyone, I am Gavish and I welcome you to yet another episode of the Skeptical Student Show. More than half of the total population of India is under 25 years of age. And according to a survey done by Guttmacher Institute, New York, in 2019, more than 75% of abortions amongst adolescents in India are unsafe, posing an increased risk of complications and death. Also, the country ranks third in terms of number of HIV patients. All of this points to one thing, and that is the lack of sex education in India. Well, I am not an expert, but I certainly have one with me on board. Welcome, Dr. Arvindh Santhosh, an established gynecologist and also a fellow podcaster from Team Helen of India Film Project's Podcast Lab. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Thank you so much for having me, Gavish. It's an honor to be here.
Same here.
Blast from the Past segment.
So, we will kickstart this episode by talking about our experiences, which is a part of our first segment where we reflect back. So, my first question will be based on, since you are a doctor and must have had the privilege of going to med school in addition to a usual school. So, have you ever witnessed any weird or unusual experiences during sex education? For example, I'll begin by sharing one of mine. So, once upon a time in school, during one of our periods, all the girls were huddled and taken to the auditorium, whilst the boys were to remain in the class. So we were very curious as to what secret operation was going on. And later, I learned that the girls were told about good touch, bad touch, menstruation, and how to act, so to say, in front of boys, among other things along those lines. So my only question after learning this is, why were the boys excluded in this exercise? Is it that sex education is not necessary for boys as for the girls? Or why are girls asked to act properly wherein boys are never told to behave? Shouldn't the jobs of schools be to normalize these conversations instead of making them all the more exclusionary?
Yes, so you are absolutely right. Schools have to be inclusive. What I felt, like what you asked us, when I was in my school, when I was doing my 11th and 12th standards, to be frank, all of us, we had this reproduction chapter in our school, right? As usual, we had to skip that chapter. During my, I think around the 9th and 10th standard, we skipped that chapter. And
Wow.
because in 11th and 12th, we had to be in biology group, we had to attend that because like questions used to come from that session. So 9th and 10th, it was just like forgotten. And in 11th and 12th, because it had to happen, we had a special class wherein everyone was in one class. It was a very nervous session where I could see that the teacher, she just wanted to get over with it. She just wanted to finish the chapter and like run out to the staff room. So I still remember that. So I mean, that is, I think, the same scenario in almost all schools in India. Few privileged ones have a very good sex education session or something like that. But yeah, as you said, boys and girls have to be educated together, and including boys is going to help them understand what girls go through.
Exactly.
Right. So that is what I think we are lacking in India. And this is something which has to be addressed because many developed countries do that. Many developed countries talk about sex education in their classrooms quite early. And they are even having counselors to give them advice about contraceptive use. Now we cannot even utter the word contraception in our schools. So this is something which they are open to because they know this is going to be a problem, and that is how they address this. And we need to also be understanding that our children are also growing like that, and it's a very small world. So we need to be ready for that.
Yes, exactly. And when you talked about your teachers even being afraid to talk about the topic, I think this is a paradoxical loop wherein the teacher was even not taught properly, and that is why afraid to speak about it. So this is a cyclic loop which we need to end.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the things which I want to tell you, because people need to understand that sex education does not happen just at school. When you have people who give you sex education or who are supposed to educate you about sex, and where they themselves are not aware about it or they themselves are not trained for it, it is not going to work.
Yes.
problem pinpoints and seeking solutions segment.
Now, talking specifically about the problems. Why do you think that talking about sex is such a taboo in India? You must have seen that even mockingly, people joke around saying that India fears to talk about sex, yet has the second largest population in the world. But I think this statement is not ironical, but is complimentary because in India, we do not have sex education. That is why we lack family planning and hence the population.
Yeah,
So, why do you think such taboo exists?
this is actually a very interesting question, and this actually has a historical aspect to this. Many people don't address it. So we all know that the world famous literature for sex is Kama Sutra, right? Or an Indian sage who wrote that. So what happened to the history of sex in India? We have a lot of temples, we have a lot of artworks which describe a lot of sexual position, highly open and highly liberal sexual explorations and all that things happened in our past in our country. They had a very positive approach towards sex. What started with the imperialism and colonialism, when we were invaded by the Britishers, they actually had a very closed mind about sex. So the Victorian era in the British rule was actually very prohibitive. They were against a lot of sexual practices. So what happened was, because we are ruled by them, our habits also became to change, and that is why we are having a very closed attitude, and we feel that sex is a taboo now. But historically, we were actually a very open civilization.
Yes, points well made. And I think those who are projecting themselves as the protector of Indian values should actually go around and check out Ajanta caves and the sculptures there to learn about the real history of India and stop promoting European propaganda. Moving on to the next question. What potential problems can arise due to sex being taboo in India, which leads to sexual illiteracy?
Sex being a taboo in India is going to be a problem, right? So let us take an example of a girl. She is an adolescent girl who is like just going to school, and she is being molested or she is being harassed by people, right? And this girl, because she has not thought that this is wrong, and she's not thought that this is something which she has to report to her teachers or to her parents or someone who's authority. She doesn't do that because she is scared. She will talk to only people whom she can confide it with. Those people whom they can confide it is going to be people their own age, their own friends. And imagine a friends who are in a similar state. They don't know what to do, right? And then to mount it out, they are going to be in an adolescent stage wherein their hormones are going to play a role. They are going to be attracted to the opposite sex.
Or even to the same? I mean, we can't generalize.
Yeah, yeah, we can't generalize. Yeah, but the problem is like, we don't, and they might end up experimenting, right? They might be in a relationship which can be a very bad one, and it can end up in a pregnancy, or it can even end up in that harassment becoming full-blown sexual assault. And it is normal to be attracted to girls of your age, but then you need to know where to stop. See, this is going to affect the society as a whole, and is going, if we stop talking about it, it's going to affect the entire education. It is going to affect them going to college. It is going to affect the huge female workforce coming into the economy. All that is going to get affected. One small effect can generate a very big domino effect, and it can lead to something else completely unpredictable.
Yes, exactly. And I think sexual illiteracy only opens up a Pandora box of problems. Goes against women empowerment, how it goes against the LGBTQ community, and how also it promotes sex crimes. Speaking of which, what do you think is the correlation between sexual illiteracy and sex crimes?
There's a very high correlation between that. Thing is like, there's a lot about sexual illiteracy. There's a lot of things, but the point is like, sex education can have the same effect, and it can actually decrease our crime rate. Assault against women, it can decrease the number of rape crimes and hate crimes against women, acid attacks, all that can go down. And imagine what we can do if all that goes down, and how much of women empowerment that can bring in to our country, and thereby better economy and our education and everything else.
Yes, that is true. In India only, there is an ongoing debate about criminalizing marital rape. And I think one correlation can be drawn out of this debate that these men who are against this are basically the ones who were not taught the importance of consent. So, as we also spoke about earlier, and so is the popular notion, It is often said that our parents are our first teachers, but quote unquote education is supposed to take place at school. So, who really is responsible for imparting sex education to children, according to you?
See, both of them have a very important role. You can't negate each person's role here. And it works as a team effort. Kids will see parents and they will see how they behave with each other. Like how their father treats the mother and how the mother treats the father. They'll be observing what goes on in the home, right? And the basic part of sex education, wherein that they find that okay, both mom and dad are equal, and then they communicate with each other, and even if they fight, they don't abuse each other, they don't hit each other, and that is very impressionable to a young child's mind. And similarly, once you go to school, they have to see how they, like how their peers interact with each other. And here the teacher's role is there to tell them that, to guide them that this is right, this is wrong, like, this is not what you do, this is not how you talk to a friend, and this is not how you talk to a girl, this is not how you talk to the boy, stuff like that. Because I vaguely remember that when I was in my sixth standard, I had one guy in my class. He told a girl that he loves her. Okay, the next minute, teacher came and he slapped him in front of everyone.
Oh my
Okay,
god.
and I was actually sitting next to the guy, and I remember that. But imagine that guy would have been scarred for life. So this is exactly what is going wrong, right? So what should have happened is the teacher should have told that, see, this is because you are becoming an adult and like you have these hormones in your body and you feel this way. This is not right. This is wrong. Apologize to that girl and make sure that you are friends and you don't like do anything. That's something how this should have ended, but it ended with two slaps, that guy crying uncontrollably in a class of 40 children. So both have a role, and it's better that they cooperate with each other. They talk to each other once in a while and find out how the child is growing in response to their sex education. Parents and teachers don't understand that certain traumatic events children will remember for a long time. We need to think that far.
Yes, that is correct. Moving on, I'm sure that it must have been quite some time since you completed your education. So, has there been any progress so far? What is the status of sex education in India, according to you?
Like we talked about before, right? People who are giving sex education now are not trained. They themselves did not get any sex education when they were younger. So most often, the people who provide sex education in schools or in colleges are not professionally trained people, right? And to be honest, we don't have any university based or any like college based programs for sex education, right? What we believe is, we believe in a psychologist or someone who has done some course in counseling, and that particular person, based on his or her experiences, starts to provide counseling for sex education. There is no uniform standardized certified program to train and to teach counselors how to give sex education and counsel. That is the first thing. Second thing is, because of this huge lacunae, because of counselors and people who are trained to do counseling, we now have a lot of people getting into it. We have people who call themselves influencers on social media who are not qualified. We don't know what their experiences are. See, and some of them are actually quite great, and some of them actually are quite good. But then there's no way to qualify them whether they're doing the right thing or not. And it is very important that any authority, legalized or government authority, takes this up. They find a uniform curriculum or something, at least at the state level, so that they can find out just how to address this issue and address properly, so that they can give quality sex education to all the children and adolescents. That is what I want to tell. And the thing is, like, because we are having this outburst of social media and so many people claiming to be sex educators, you're going to have a lot of wrong information as well. So that also has to be dealt with, because you when you get very wrong information, and some of them actually, like, they start promoting certain health supplements or like certain medications which they are not supposed to do. It's easy money. It's very easy money for influencers to advertise a product and get money, but it is going to affect a lot of people, and they won't be able to get out of the harms which they have been into because of all these wrongly trained or like insufficiently trained people on social media.
Great. So, there is a need to distinguish psychologists from sex therapists,
Yeah.
and also the need to be aware of misinformation.
Yeah, and we also require a proper training program for everyone who want to do this as a profession.
Exactly. Now, with reference to the last question, recently, queer affirmative changes were made in the MBBS syllabus by revising the unscientific text. So, what possible curriculum changes do you think are yet to be made?
Right. So that was actually in the subject of forensic medicine. But the issue was they are based on the Indian Penal Code. And the Indian Penal Code is actually not revised very often. So when the argument claimed that no, like we need to update the medical textbooks, which is very good, which is very important. The problem is they also had to update the IPC sections and the penalties. We need to work on all the sectors, not just health. And most importantly, we need to address that we need to bring in gender fluid norms into our curriculum. That is one thing. We need to have courses on how to do counseling and how to give them treatment and how to address them. Okay, there's a lot of things which are actually very new. I mean, like medical textbooks around the world are lagging behind in getting updated on certain fronts. We need to like improve our medical textbooks and our legal textbooks to include people who are gender non-binary.
Yes, and you spoke about gender neutrality, and in one of my episodes called The Queer Collective Consciousness, I've actually spoken about this. And in conclusion, I think the road to change is a long one, but we just can't stop walking. Towards our last question, when children don't get educated from the right sources, they turn to other sources of information. Does banning porn make sense to you? Although it's not really banned, I mean, there's ways to access it, but that is a joke, actually.
Yeah. So banning porn will have the same effect towards sex education and sex crimes as banning COD or PUBG has towards terrorism, right?
Yes.
This is just a very, very stupid correlation. So, and the thing is like porn is more of an art form, is what people who do porn tell. They associate it as an art form, and there is a very big market for it. Sex education is not to be confused with porn. Sex education is something completely different, and it is required for people even to watch porn, because only then will they know what is, because it's an act. It's like every normal movie, every Bollywood or Hollywood or whatever wood movie we watch, it is the same there. They have the camera setup, they have a script, they actually have a script, and then they act and the most important part is, even in porn movies, they believe that consent is very important, and they will not do what the other performer does not like. If someone does something the performer does not like, they will withdraw their contract, and that gets cut immediately. So many of the proper legalized companies which do all these adult films actually have a very strong background check, and they test themselves for sexually transmitted infections very often, almost once in a month or 2 months. And they talk to their performers, they have regular counseling sessions, and the performers, before they do a scene, they meet each other, they greet them, they get to a common understanding of what they're comfortable with, and then they proceed. So this is something which is not shown in the final product of the final movie. So the most important part, which is all happening behind the scenes, is not something which the people who watch porn know. So what they say is, oh, this is something which is normal, this is what I think I should do, right? So people are going to get confused, but then like there are now certain companies who actually make all these things which are happening behind the scene normal, and they actually like put it up, and even in YouTube. So they tell this is what happens in a porn film, this is the behind the scenes video of this porn scene, and so on. So and then they have the performers come and talk about, okay, this is what happened, and I am not comfortable with this, and this is what I think you should also do, right? So this is something which is completely different, and sex education is not going to do what porn is going to do. Sex education is more important, and this will actually like help people understand porn better, if you ask me. So you cannot get sex education from porn. First thing, sex education is very important for you to even realize that porn is just an act and not something which is real.
Remember as kids when something was deemed out of reach for us, and when we were told not to do something, there was all the more curiosity to try it out.
Yeah,
I think this is something very similar with porn as well.
yeah,
And I think when you ban porn, so what kind of message are you giving away? The message which is being given away is that sex work is not real work, whereas the message should be that it very much is. And also, when your own ministers are caught watching porn in the parliament, I think the entire purpose gets defeated.
yeah, exactly.
So it is actually a whole mockery.
Yes, yes, very true.
Moral of the episode.
Well, we are heading towards the end of this episode, and now I would like to hear from you in your last words on this podcast, the moral of this episode.
The moral is sex education is very important, and like every other subject, it is not something which should be stuck into one or two chapters in one or two sections or classes. It is something which the child has to grow through, starting with very basic things in kindergarten towards the full blown sexual education concepts in their higher secondary school or high school. This is something like your maths or physics or chemistry, which has to grow from the beginning and not just one chapter in one textbook in one class.
All right, that is great.
Supplementary segment.
Well, as a part of the last segment on my show, we have something to give back to our listeners to remember this episode by. It can be anything of value. And for this particular episode, I would like to recommend to the listeners to check out Dr. Arvind's own podcast called The G Spot, which is actually a sex education based podcast. If you found this episode interesting, I'm sure you would find that interesting as well. So, anyone interested to check the podcast out, the link to the podcast will be made available in the episode description. And lastly, thank you so much, Dr. Arvind, for agreeing to do this and for taking out time and for having a conversation on such important topic. It was a pleasure to host you.
Thank you so much for having me, Gabashti.
All right.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And if you think we missed a point, or if you would simply want to stay connected, you can follow us on Instagram. I am called Gavish Raptor with GAVISH_RAPTOR. And I'm available on LinkedIn and Facebook and Twitter as well with the same name. Doctor, how can the listeners reach out to you?
So they can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. The handle is actually at the Gynec, at THEGUYNEC.
Thank you so much. And if you found this episode to be relatable, don't forget to share it with a friend and follow the podcast to not miss an episode.
You were listening to the Skeptical Student Show by Gavish Raptor, created as a part of Podcast Lab by India Film Project in association with Anchor by Spotify.